Started, I guess. Yeah, it's good. Thanks everybody so much for coming. Thank you. I'm excited to share this new work with you. Thanks for being here. My name's Evan. I'm a visual artist. I've been living in Berlin the last 5 years. I'm going to talk today about a piece of software called Worlds and Figures and how that connects to some of the work I've been making recently. Maybe before jumping straight into the software, I'll just give a very quick overview of my work. A lot of the work I've been working on is having to do with sort of unseen aspects of technologies. This is a series called Since You Were Born. Earlier versions of my work were doing more technology projects in public space that had to do with thinking about agency and where we have agency within the media landscape. Net art, I love net art. Net art's always been a big influence of mine. I make net art from time to time. Specifically interested in sort of unintended uses of networks, tools, and technologies. Leading up to this project, the last series that I was working on is called Landscapes or Red Lines. This project had to do more with like the physicality of the internet, thinking about that in relationship to landscapes and thinking about that in relationship to history. So this new series, this Worlds and Figures series, it started while I was doing research for that Red Lines project. This was back in 2019. And as part of that research, I'd stumbled into this software called G-Projector. Has anybody ever used G-Projector before? I found this on the NASA website, and I think it's used mostly for weather modeling, but I thought it was such a kind of beautiful, clean user interface that was doing some things that I really liked. And so this is what G-Projector looks like. You're presented with the world. You have this drop-down menu full of mapping projections, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it's just kind of simple and poetic in how it functions. And a lot of the work that I was doing with Red Lines had to do, I was trying to make this attempt to connect the relationship between ideology and networks and ideology and landscape and think about how those are connected to historical precedents. And this software was sort of doing that, I felt like, all within this one drop-down menu. So this one drop-down menu, it just has all the names of these different cartographers throughout history who were making these different mapping projections, almost all from either North America or Europe, all white, all male. You click their names and the world updates based on their sort of ideas, right? And so this one drop-down menu I felt like was kind of capturing all that in a way that I had been trying to do with this Red Lines project. So that was like one point of influence for me. The second was at the tail end of that Red Lines project, I was getting more into thinking about slow art making practices, like slowness as a sort of practice in response to sort of accelerationist tendencies. Thinking about painting as kind of like an original slow-based image making process. And so with kind of the confluence of those three things, like thinking about slowness, dipping my toes into the water of cartography, and then this one drop-down menu from this G-Projector software, I had this idea. I wanted to do a painting show, was dealing with cartography as a way to sort of talk about bias in other systems that we use, our technical systems. And so to do that, I needed to make software. So this is the Worlds and Figures software. This is what I'll be sort of stemming the presentation from today. And I thought before opening that up, I would just show where it ended. It's like this project, I started working on this project with the developer Shazar in 2019, and up until September of last year, it was just me as the user. Like I was the only one using it. And it was for this exhibition that just closed in December at the Berlin State Library on Unter den Linden. And I found this place because it's where the research led me. So the Berlin State Library in Unter den Linden has a maps reading room. And this was where I was doing some of the research, and it ended up being the place where I sort of premiered this painting series, released the software. And so the idea was that the work that I was making was then sort of living with the books I was finding, the periodicals, living with the sort of artifacts that were in that space. And so it resulted in this painting series, this mural, which is actually still there. If anybody, the show has closed, but if anybody wants to go see the mural and a couple paintings, it's still up. And when the show was open and I was giving tours of the exhibition, I would always find myself starting with the software. Like the software was one small piece of the exhibition, and I found myself kind of beginning there. And it was, like usually you'd have like an exhibition text, but I was feeling like the software was really sort of the context for understanding that work. And so that's what we'll talk about today. If anybody is on like laptops and you want to open up the software and follow along, please feel free to do that. You could try on your phone, although it probably isn't going to work very well on the phone. But it runs in a browser. You just go to worldsandfigures.com. You click software. I have a window of it open here. I'm just going to, well, this can be part of the demo. I'm going to change some of these dimensions here. This is where you set screen display, so I'm going to reduce the size a little bit to save my laptop some video card. Okay, let's say that looks good. Maybe I'll increase the opacity or decrease the opacity on the map a little bit. So when the software boots up, it looks like this. On the left side, you have the sort of visual window where things are being rendered. And on the right side, you have this control palette with all the different controls and layers. And in the next 23 minutes, I'm just going to march down this system of controls on the right side and talk about some of how it's working and some of why it's working. Maybe, in fact, I kind of already showed how the canvas dimensions work. I might go back to that, but I'm going to skip to the projection section here. And this is me recreating that drop-down menu from the G projector software. So this has 120 of these mapping projections, ranging from 150 AD to 2018. And maybe just to dip into mapping projections for a second, if you're not familiar, I wasn't when I first started doing this project, but mapping projections are just how do we take a three-dimensional spherical set of data like the globe, how do we flatten that to a printed page or a screen? There's many different ways of doing this over time. Hundreds of years, cartographers have been trying to figure out different ways of doing that, having different rationales for doing that. These are some of the projections included in the software. And one of the reasons there's so many is because this is, it's a sort of failed premise. Like there's no perfect way to do this. You'll hear cartography people talk a lot about smashing the orange, right? Like there's no way to take an orange and peel it and flatten it perfectly. Something has to give in terms of position, scale, orientation. So there's no, it's like a good thing to keep in mind, like when you're looking at a map, they're all narratives, they're all flawed in some way. And so it's a good entry point to start thinking critically about who's being centered within those maps. So that's kind of the inherent problem in mapping projections. Part of the reason why I think they are a good example in thinking about technology. But so in this drop-down menu, we can go look at a stereographic projection. We can go look at, maybe if we're going to talk more about bias, we should go to Mercator. That's always a good one. So this is the Mercator projection from 1569. This is one that most of us are probably the most visually familiar with. It's the one that Google Maps uses. And Mercator, I'm mentioning it because Mercator is known to have a north-up bias. Like it does lots of things really well, but one of the things, especially from a more modern perspective, to be critical of it about is that it has this north bias. I'm going to change the color so we can see it a little bit better here. Let's make it a nice blue here. So if you look at the scale of North America to South America, the scale of Europe to Africa, these are vastly disproportionate to reality. So this diagram's showing in the black outline is the Mercator projection, and then in the green is a equal area projection, they call it. So in this case, I think it's the Gall-Peters projection, but it's a projection that prioritizes area being in proportion to each other. So you can see the scale change from Africa, and you can see the scale change from South America to North America. And these discrepancies, they're important because it changes how we see the world, and they can be dangerous because these falsities lead to what gets priorities and what gets deprioritized. So that's the mapping projection drop-down menu. Here are the controls for how to scale, where it's being rotated around. Offset can also be controlled by clicking and dragging. I'm going to go back to stereographic, which I think is nicer. So if I keep scrolling down here below this projection section, the next one is custom image. And custom image is just talking about what's the base layer, what's the image that's being pulled in behind all the geographic data. And so if I go back, it's maybe easier to see here. When you first open up the software, it's going to look more like this. So you have these like 12 colored bars in the background. And these 12 colored bars are coming from the telecommunications industry. And so if you're to go dig up a fiber optic cable, basically anywhere in the world, cut into it, what you'll find are these 12 colored inner tubes. You cut into one of those, you get another 12 coming out, and the glass, the fiber, is in these little tiny sort of strands at the end. And so these color coding systems are how you address which fiber strand you want to talk to. And so for example, if I wanted to address this strand right here, I could say, okay, the outer one is orange, the inner one is red, and we could take that to a chart and find out if I go orange, red, that's strand number 74, for example. Well, Why does this matter? it's, there's places within the software where I'm trying to make this connection between what's happening in cartography and what's happening within networks and what's happening within technology. So the color coding is like one little clue getting us closer and closer to that sort of conversation. And so those 12 colors, they are what I paint with primarily now. They show up in the paintings anyway that I'm making at the moment, or that I made for this show. So the base layers that I was using were always those 12 colors, and they were based on flag geometries, which I probably won't go into as much now, but there's this relationship between map making and flag making and thinking about how ideology exists there. And so the base layers that went into these paintings looked something like this. And the way those work is you can replace that background layer with any sort of JPEG or PNG file by just dragging it in. And so I would start by making these kind of false flags, just not representing any specific country, but just looking at the geometry of flags. Those would become the base layers. And then the base layer then is subject to the same sort of mathematical distortions that the mapping projection is being influenced by. I'm gonna go back to stereographic. Where did it go? Up here. So this was kind of part of my process. I mean, the software got developed over the course of a few years, but it was up and running quickly enough where a lot of my time painting started here by sort of just manipulating these variables. And it doesn't have to be flags. It can be, it can be any image, any nice romantic landscape here. We could drag in, and you could turn off. We could turn off everything except that base layer, and start thinking about just how to manipulate images with these historic mapping algorithms, maybe in a way that wasn't maybe intended, but in a way that, I don't know, to me was interesting. Okay, I'm gonna get rid of that landscape. Let's go back to these color bars for a little while. Okay. So that gets us through projection, that gets us through custom image. Then we reach this visualization section. This is essentially, it's a set of layers. They're all vector layers. These are all just in here because during the research phase of the project, I got interested in them. Okay, so the software was really like made for me. It's released now. It's open source. It's for everybody at the moment. But I kind of intentionally kept it based on just what I was making. So you can feel free to fork this and make it your own. But right now we're looking at kind of what were my interests at the time. I'll just march through some of these relatively quickly here. I'm going to change the base layer again so that we can see the graticule. Graticule is essentially just the longitude and latitude lines you're familiar with. This comes from Ptolemy in 150 AD. It's in addition to doing other things, it's also a good system for starting to understand how distortions happen within mapping projections. So if we look at the graticule for Mercator, for example, and we zoom out a little bit, you can start to see how everything starts to get compressed towards the equator and it get elongated as we get closer to the poles. That's the graticule. Which one comes next here? TISO indicatrices. Okay, TISO indicatrices are another system for understanding mapping distortions. They are these series of dots. The basic idea is that you would take a spherical globe, like on the right, you cover those in a grid of perfect circles, and then when it gets flattened, you can compare how those circles get distorted in relationship to each other. So right now the Mercator projection's up, so we can see in this one, size is obviously distorted, right? But if we look at the shape of those circles, they're still perfect circles. So if I were to switch to an equal area projection, like, I don't know, let's do equal Earth maybe, you can see in this one, these dots stay closer to the same size, but they're being distorted in terms of they're being turned into ellipses now, right? So some at different orientations. So this is just a way of sort of starting to understand how these distortions are happening from this translation from sphere to plane. So in the paintings, they show up a lot for me. So these aren't land masses. These are this connection back to this distortion visualization tool. So that's TISO. If I keep going, next is world map. Not so much to say about world map. Maybe I'll turn off TISO for a bit. And the next one is the Great Lakes layer. This is me centering myself within the map as map maker. Let me just see if I can turn on the Great Lakes here. Can you see them here? Maybe if I center them, scale them up. So this is where I'm from. I was born and raised in Michigan, which is here. My home state is shaped like a mitten, okay? So people from Michigan don't need maps. So when we meet each other, Michiganders like, oh, I'm come from Okemos, you know, it's a little bit, it's kind of like east of Lansing, like it's a real thing. And so now the Great Lakes that make Michigan this peninsula and give it its shape, they're the only internal bodies of water in the data set I'm using to represent the geometry of the globe. So this is sort of me inserting some of my own biases within the system. It shows up within the paintings as these little, they're kind of like Easter eggs, but Michigan shows up, so you'll know to look for them. How are we on time? Okay, we're okay. So the next layer is submarine cables. So maybe I'll just turn everything off except for the fiber optic cables for a moment. And let's go to, we can look at a version of the world if it was just the fiber optic cables. It would look like this. So those are the fiber optic cables. The next layer down from there is the all red line, which since my base layer is red, I'm going to make blue today. Many of you might already be familiar with this. This is a connection back to my previous work as well, and the work of many others also, but the all red line is the name, it's the name given to the first telegraph cable to circumnavigate the globe. It's intended as a British military advantage, landing only in British-controlled territories, and these British imperial maps had this common practice of coloring those territories red, so the name all red line comes from connecting these red territories on the map. And this is one of the reasons why my past series was in this red sort of hue. But I include it here, and I include it right below the fiber optic cable layer as this reminder that, like our current network, it didn't follow the cloud, right? It has this connection, it has this very imperialist connection to this pre-existing network, and it shares a lot of the same beaches as come up in the same place out of the water. So that's the all red line. The layers, all the layers after the all red line are just heads. So let me turn on some heads here. I'm going to turn off submarine cables, turn off the all red line. Maybe we turn back on our graticule, can chill it out a little bit. Okay. So this is another system like the graticule, like the TISO indicatrices for visualizing how distortions are happening during this flattening process. Maybe I'll turn this blue so we can see it. Let's turn on one more maybe. There's another nice one. Maybe that's a nice one. Okay, so it's sometimes referred to as Gedimind heads. But it was coming from cartographic academic circles where people were discussing and trying to talk about distortions. And the idea was that if you remove all the geographic data from the map and you replace it just with the human face, that our brains are so hardwired to seeing like subtle differences in cheekbones and eyebrows and noses and chins that we would see how those would get distorted in ways that we might not if we were just looking at the continent outlines, which we have no perfect perception of what they look like flat because they're not flat. And so this was like a moment in the research for me that I had kind of two feelings on. And the first was I thought it was kind of poetic. Like I liked this idea that if we're trying to understand how the world is distorted, to see ourselves within it, I liked that as kind of a gesture. But then on the other hand, in any example I could find of this, whether I was looking in the printed material at the library or looking online at people that were doing more modern things with code, it's always, every time, been a man's head. And so this system that's been set up to sort of see these distortions, it also has this very specific bias, and then now we're looking at the world through that bias. And so there's these two sides of this technique that I was sort of interested in playing with in the work, or exposing in the work. And in the very beginning, I was thinking, before the idea to make the software, I was thinking maybe I could be making a database of these profiles so that when cartographers were looking to use this in code-based systems today, they would have this wider range of these faces to pull from. And I kind of quickly went away from that, and I was thinking, okay, rather than that, instead of a database, we could make a tool so that cartographers could pull in faces that they have intimate relationships with, faces that they know, their own faces, the faces of loved ones. This is my wife and I a very long time ago, Michelle. So it's her face that shows up in the software and shows up in the painting. And the idea is that, I mean, this is the software that I'm making for myself, right? It's the software that, it's her face that as it starts to bend and get distorted, that I'm gonna notice exactly what's getting distorted, where it's getting distorted. It's her face that I see more than my own face, right? And so the idea is that then cartographers using this system could add vector layer, drag and drop an SVG file into here, and then that would be added as a layer below the last head here. So that people could be using the faces that they are familiar with when they're trying to see and understand what distortion are. Also, if you're just looking to distort some vector material, that's where you would do it. It doesn't have to be a face, obviously. The next window down is export. So this is, you hit download, it basically is going to download a data file containing all the setup for the software, so you could reload it. A raster file is a PNG file, which is just an export of what you see on screen. You can control the size of that back up here in the canvas dimensions. If you want to work at print resolution, you can decrease the display resolution so that you're rendering something larger than what you see on screen. And it exports vector files. And so the vector files for me were the handoff between what I was doing on screen and what I was doing painting in the studio. And so my process was I would take those exported vector files, I would have those digitally cut into like adhesive vinyl. The adhesive vinyl would become painting masks, like one for each color, similar to any sort of hard edge painting technique. And that would be the translation between how I was going from the software to the painted canvas. Animation this was like a late add to the software. I mean, the software, I won't go into it, but basically it was like myself and Shazar was a developer. I'll talk about him and thank him more verbosely at the end. But there was a lot of development in the beginning where we got it running and I was using it. And then it was more like me coming back to him every few months, like, could we add this? Could we add this? Could we add this? And the animation came about because at that time I had spent so much time manipulating these sliders. Maybe let's turn on some more layers just so it'll look a little bit prettier. What could we turn on? Let's turn the world map back on. Maybe we get some, I don't know. Let's do some submarine cables. Okay. So I would spend so much time experimenting with different projections. Maybe I haven't shown Litro yet. It's my favorite. Okay. So I'd spend a lot of time just doing this, playing with projections, turning on and off different layers, and then just manipulating these sliders. And after doing that for weeks and weeks and months, I realized that I had a much better conception, at least personally, of how these projections were functioning by having like my hand move and seeing the data set update. Like rather than just seeing printed maps or on screen examples online, like there was something about moving the hand and seeing everything move and feel how the poles were kind of pulling on that geometry. And so the idea was to build in an animation functionality that would replicate what I'm doing now, just moving sliders. And so if I wanted to replicate this animation right now, for example, I would go down to the animation section, we'd leave the y-axis checked, I'd start at 0, maybe if I wanted a really nice smooth animation, we'd bump the increment down to like 0.2 or something, and then it would cycle through 360 degrees, and I would have that animation to kind of do whatever you want with. And what I've been doing with it lately is experimenting with taking cloud-based photography, skyscape photography, and implementing that into the animation section. So the work that I've been making these last few weeks, like through this winter basically, like if anybody lives in Berlin or has been here through a winter, like the gray here is like so real. And so this project was really giving me an excuse that anytime the clouds would break, I would run out, try to find high ground, and get photos of like the sky trying to peek through. I know today's been nice, this is not normal. Like today is great. And so I've been taking these skyscape photography photos in my neighborhood, the sky right over my apartment. And we can just see what that might look like. So if I take one of those photos, drag it in here, maybe we turn off all the other data for a moment. These might look familiar if you've seen the animations just outside here. There's one more layer hiding this one. So then rather than thinking about these paintings, I was really thinking more about animations. And again, just playing with sliders, trying to figure out what combination of these sliders, what combination of different mapping projections were going to affect these different views. It was kind of hard to predict, to be honest, about what gets the center of the photo, what ends up being manipulated in different ways, what's getting distorted a lot, what's sort of not being moved that much. And so then I would find some, let's say I really liked this one. Maybe I want to zoom out a little bit. Like maybe I'm thinking this is starting to look nice. No, maybe the x-axis. Yeah. So then I would render this out on the x-axis. And this are becoming these series, which I'll show you in a second here. And this series, it shares a lot with the paintings, obviously, because it's coming from the same software. So conceptually, a lot of what is true for the paintings is true for these. But these last like couple months, let's say, with making this series, I've been thinking a lot about this relationship between circles and squares, kind of on an archetypal level, and thinking about how historically, especially in the Renaissance, there was this really rush for mathematicians to solve this problem of squaring the circle. Maybe you've heard that phrase before. And the problem was like, how can you make a square and a circle of equal area using just a straight edge and a compass? And mathematicians were vying to solve this problem first. It was later discovered it was impossible due to the transcendental nature of pi. You just can't do this. And so now that phrase squaring the circle, if you've heard it or not, like it has to do with this idea of like trying to solve an impossible project. And so I kind of like that idea of impossibility in the way that it relates back to the impossibility of taking the spherical Earth and flattening it, or the impossibility of making systems devoid of bias. And so this was like one connection I was interested in. There's also a lot of circle and square action happening in various like religious iconography and a lot of architecture happening across various cultures. Typically, like the circle often represents heaven, this like perfect, unknowing, unknowable, circular shape, heaven, and the square being more like the four corners of the earth, the four cardinal coordinates, the four seasons. And so kind of with all of that swirling around, I made these skyscapes. This is the link if you're interested to go see them. They're net art pieces, so they can be viewed in the browser. I'm going to share the notes link later if you don't want to write down this really long URL right now. It's partially the reason it's long is that when you connect to that link, you're connecting to my home. So I'm running the server from my basement. And the idea is that by accessing that link, you're sort of coming into my house and you're accessing these sky manipulations of the sky over my apartment. And there's some, I'll just show them and I'll talk over them. There's some connections back to the sort of Red Lines project for me in a sense that these are also kind of thinking about slow practices, thinking about how slowness can be incorporated into work, especially work that's connected to the internet. For me, I think they're meant to be lived with. So like I've been living with these the last couple of months where I wash dishes. So if you have like an old phone or an old laptop, or you have a charging station where you charge your tablet or your phone, it can be a good place to set these on there. And then you have this like window to more colorful skies as you're sitting washing dishes under the gray clouds. And so this is the first time I'm publishing them. Is like right now they're kind of officially published. They're officially out there as of now. There's going to be a small opening at the Rosa Gallery, which is in Mitte, which is near my apartment. It was near where the photographs were shot. At this Gallery Rosa that's been specializing in net art. They do really great work. It's very small, but if you feel like coming, it opens in 25 minutes and it goes. It goes to 10:30, but you can also see them outside here. But there's an invitation to come. So if you're going to Berghain tonight, this is on your way. Okay, it's the same direction. Also, an invitation if you're interested either in seeing the work that is still at the library, this mural or the paintings, or if you just are into this cartography jam, I highly recommend the Maps Reading Room at the Berlin Library. It's kind of a gem that a lot of people haven't seen even in Berlin yet. So it's not open on the weekend, but the Maps Reading Room is another invitation I'd like to make. And then I'm getting towards the end. The last section of the software is the credits section. So I want to make sure to give a heartfelt thank you to Cesar Mokan, who I was lucky enough to have in my studio in 2019 here in Berlin. Brilliant programmer, incredible artist. The software kind of exists because he totally took it on. Like I was just sprouting off all this stuff in the studio. Like, oh, this G projector software. And he's like, I could probably do that, we could do this. And he just was like, anytime ideas were there, he was down to just kind of make it happen. And he was with me on this project, for like 3 years, sort of developing and building it up. Also just a great person. He's making great art. Go check out his artwork. The source code for the software is on his GitHub page. So it's the Worlds and Figures on Cesar's GitHub page. Some very quick open source shout out thank yous. One is to the telegeography for the submarine cable data, which we're using. Another is the React JavaScript libraries, which we're using. A huge thank you to the D3Geo libraries, which are where we got a lot of the projection algorithm mathematics from. That's where I'm going to leave it. Thanks to Transmediale. Thanks for coming. I know everyone's hungry. Let's get out of here. If anybody wants to come to Rosa, I'll be there. Thank you.